uh, to share her thoughts about policy, particularly from a business perspective, what it means for California business, what it means, for what does regulation mean in terms of being able to attract and retain businesses in California. What about lawsuits? All of that. What I find really interesting when I was reading over Jennifer Barrera, who's our guest today, the CEO and president of the California Chamber of Commerce, was that she has a very similar background to mine. We both come from the employment law background. And so I found that pretty interesting. And she's had a really interesting career working in private practice, representing employers, and then going on and working for the Chamber. And we'll talk about some of the things the Chamber has done to represent business interests at the state capitol. So with that, I want to introduce our guest, Jennifer Barrera. By the way, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that she's one of us in the sense that she's from the Valley, I guess, because she did go to Cal State Bakersfield. And I know when I speak with President Zelezny at Cal State Bakersfield, she regularly reminds me of that fact, of their illustrious alums, and this is one of them. So with that, the floor is yours. I thought maybe you could start with some general comments about regulations in California, how it affects business, and then we can get into some Q&A. So Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction and for inviting me to come and speak today. I appreciate it. And I am one of you. I grew up near Bakersfield, not in Bakersfield, went to Cal State Bakersfield, as Mark said. But I have family that still lives in Fresno. Two of my family members are Fresno State alumni. So we are very Central Valley focused in our family for sure, and proud of it.
I should mention 1 second, Jennifer, just so you know, and I was remiss not doing this. You look behind me there, you'll see our logo, and it has 4 universities. Cal State Bakersfield is one of our partner campuses. So I just want you to, as well as Fresno State and Cal State Stanislaus and UC Merced. So I just wanted you to know that.
Love it. Yes, UC Merced, actually, I had a chance to go visit there, and the campus is just phenomenal. Very impressive. So California business climate is always a great topic for me to speak about, of course, given my current position as the CEO and president of Cal Chamber, but also, again, given my background prior to advocacy in the legislative and regulatory arena, practicing in the courts and the judicial system on behalf of employers. California is certainly a tough business environment. There's no question about it. And there's a lot of different policy areas that make it challenging for businesses here in California as opposed to the rest of the country. And that is something that I agree with regards to mandates, regulations, costs, etc. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we don't think any regulation is necessary or reasonable. It's just the matter of some of the policies that are passed and implemented here in California that, from our perspective, may go a little bit too far with regards to some of the regulations and costs. And we can get into some of those details of what I think. But, the environment of California is changing politically. I think the business community in California is unique and different than what a lot of the stereotypes or thoughts are. There's been a very long narrative that businesses are anti-labor, they're anti-environment, they're anti-privacy, they're anti-this. And that's really not the case. In fact, I think our membership and even our board are really none of those things from that perspective. They are very much interested in developing and promoting their workforce. They're very much interested in protecting the environment. They're very much interested in dealing with some of the privacy issues that we can kind of talk about. But I think it's the way in which the policy is shaped, which is always the important part. Too many times it has been just forced upon business instead of bringing them to the table and having a discussion about how you can achieve some of these really progressive ideas that we have here in California and that the legislature promotes, but doing it in a way that does not negatively impact business. And I think our members are certainly willing partners to have those discussions and really talk about what is the best way in which to address some of these policies. But we always have to have a willing partner on the other side, which of course is the legislature, which brings in the politics of everything. So it is, a pleasure to represent the business so. And with that, I will open it up to any questions or discussions you may have. Mark, I know that was a very brief overview, but happy to kind of get into any further details that you'd like to hear about.
That's great. I'm going to take the privilege of being the host. And so I'm going to ask you some questions and we'll let other people kind of think about what they'd like to say. If you would, put your questions in the chat room and I will do my best to get to them. But I did want to ask you, you're talking about regulation. I always thought about, there's different ways to regulate. One way is to punish people for doing the wrong thing, but another way to regulate is to incentivize people to do the right thing. Do we have that balance maybe a little bit off?
Yes, I would say absolutely we have that balance off. I think very much the path or the culture has been what you just suggested, that we put forth a mandate, and if the mandate is not followed, there is a huge hammer that comes after business on the other side. And so we regulate or legislate through fear. Most of that fear is through hefty penalties. Most of that fear is through litigation, which is, just this hammer that is held over business's head, and oftentimes, from my perspective, leveraged and utilized in a fashion that is, what wasn't intended by necessarily the legislature. And we can, again, provide examples either under PAGA, the Private Attorney General Act here in California, or even CEQA, where that litigation and enforcement is really leveraged for other things. But go ahead.
Let me ask you about some, reforms you'd like to see, maybe regulatory reforms or statutory reforms. For example, a sunset provision on laws, or doing a cost benefit analysis on proposed or existing regulations. I mean, there's another side of this argument. And if you sunset laws, legislatures are dealing with hundreds of bills every year. If you add these renewals, which another 100, it will overwhelm the legislature. And so those bills will just go out. They'll never get a chance to be reviewed. That's one argument. The cost benefit argument on the other side is, well, yeah, it's easy to quantify the cost, but not so easy to quantify the benefits. So you're going to get a skewed result. I mean, so there is another side to this equation, but I want to let you kind of talk about this from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you just said with regards to the laws and regulations that are passed, to have a true economic analysis of what each one of these laws mean to the business community, both small and large, would be a significant move forward with regards to kind of enlightening the legislature and kind of the entire community what every impact is to the business community. There is no comprehensive list in any policy area that identifies the cost of what businesses are already dealing with regards to, let's just say, privacy regulations or privacy laws. There's no cost analysis or comprehensive list that says companies are already doing X, Y, and Z here in California to deal with recent laws that have been passed on the initiative for privacy data collection. And this new law is going to add another how much money to it. There's nothing like that. It is isolated. It is very unique. So there are some requirements that say for massive regulations, you have to do an economic analysis, but there's nothing that says, you know what, as a part of that economic analysis, you need to do a cumulative review of what businesses are already doing and complying with here in California and what that cost is. And so to have something like that, to just evaluate, again, what we're really asking our companies to do would be pretty significant. And as you said, Mark, yes, there are benefits to a lot of these regulations, but are those benefits are balanced with regards to the cost that we're imposing on our companies and on our small business communities, especially?
As a footnote to that, a number of years ago, I had a research analyst from the non-partisan legislative analyst office on our program, and they had done a report on cost benefit analysis of regulations and suggested, hey, the legislature can do a better job by making all these suggestions. So about a few months ago, I gave him a call. I said, oh, how's it going? I said, by the way, those recommendations you made, did they ever pick up on that? And he goes, no, not really. So really. That thought's been around for a little while. Yeah. Let me kind of switch gears a little bit. One of the things that you guys are really known for is this job killer list of bills. Yeah. And I got to tell you, it's kind of impressive. I went back and I looked over the last 10 years. And this stuff is on, you can find it on your website, actually. You have a 94% success rate when you target a bill, as we refer to it as a job killer bill, it's kind of DOA, a high percentage, which say, okay, well, that's pretty impressive. It becomes even more impressive when you think, well, wait a second, we've got a Democratic governor, we've got super majorities in both houses of the legislature with Democrats, and you've got a 94% success rate on bills, which I assume you're probably going to be favoring labor, et cetera. I got to know, how do you do it?
It's a question we are often asked. I've been with the chamber now for over 12 years, and I remember when the transition from Governor Schwarzenegger to Governor Brown came in, and all of the media reports said, the job killer list is basically dead. It's going to have no effect and no impact with these Democrat governors. And they're, when the super majority in both houses were Democrat, they basically said the same thing. And yet our job killer list continues to be successful. I think why it is successful is because we're very selective with regards to what bills ultimately get on that list. There are over 3,000 bills introduced this year. And there's only about 21 that are on our job killer list right now. So a very small number of them get on the job killer list. There are a lot of, I can say, bad bills that we don't like that are introduced out of those 3,000. And we pose and engage on approximately 300 bills every single session. But only 20 to 25, again, I think there's about 21 on our job killer list right now, make it on that list. And it's because we are very selective. We have multiple layers of analysis that really look at what these policies will do. We have outside economists look at it as well with regards to the impact it's going to have on jobs here in California and what the bill does with regards to increasing costs, discouraging companies from growing, locating to California, et cetera. That's why I think our list is so successful because, again, we're very selective and we make sure it really does fit the criteria for a job killer.
We might want to get into what bills are on the list this year, but I wanted to ask you a question because I want to be fair to our audience, and I want to start with a good general overview question. I just had it. There it is. Pete's question. Pete Weber is a former Fortune 500 CEO. He's very involved at both the regional and state level and in good government activities. And he has a pretty straightforward question, which is very Pete, because I know Pete. It's what is the impact on jobs of overregulation and abuse of well-intended laws?
Oh,
and you're probably gonna talk about CEQA or something like that, but it's yours.
I would love to have kind of a comprehensive analysis, which I don't know that exists across every policy area on the overregulation. CEQA is a good example. My favorite one that I talk about now all the time is the Private Attorney General Act in California, which, Mark, I know you have to be familiar with. But the reason I talk about it is because we actually have data to look at what the impact has been here in California, thanks to Governor Brown, who put in some transparency measures when he was governor.
Jennifer, could you explain just briefly what PAGA is?
Sure. PAGA is a California-only law. And it is in our California Labor Code, which is over 1,000 pages of different requirements on employers here in California. And except with regards to workers' compensation, it says that any employee can bring a representative action against their employer for any labor code violation that they have personally suffered or that they believe other employees have personally suffered. And it says if the labor code under which you're suing, so for example, a meal and rest period is in our labor
wage
code.
And hour, a typical wage and hour claim.
Typical wage and hour claim. If there is not a specific penalty associated with that underlying labor code, we will provide one for you under PAGA, which is $100 per employee per pay period for the first pay period, $200 per employee for every subsequent pay period, and then an automatic right to attorney's fees. So if you can just imagine, one or two violations for an employer that has 100 employees, those penalties add up pretty quickly, and the threat of attorney's fees on top of it is pretty costly. It's basically a strict liability lawsuit. So even if there was a good faith mistake or a good faith error with regards to a pay stub violation, you're still penalized. There's no defense to it. I remember, and I know I'm going to go off on a little tangent here, so please excuse me, but it's a great example of PAGA. When I was actually practicing attorney, we were representing a company in San Diego, and on the company's, let's say the company's actual name was ABC, Incorporated. On their pay stub, they only had ABC. It did not include Incorporated on it. And they were sued under PAGA for a pay stub violation, which is in the labor code. And the demand was $20 million. There was no loss.
Let me just explain. This may explain because we share this. I actually do a lot of employment mediation, and I do run into PAGA and class action claims. Under the wage and hour law, what they say, which sounds very logical, that everything on your pay stub should be accurate. So, what we're really talking about is how many hours you work, what the rate of pay is. That's the intent of the law. But if you read the statute specifically, it says any error on that pay stub is check the box. And so that's where we get into to someone misspelled, an address is incorrect or their name, that's a technical violation. So the answer is technically yes. The other thing I just want to add on, and Jennifer, you might want to comment on this. What's interesting about PAGA is if the plaintiff wins, 75% of that money goes to the state. Only 25% goes to the plaintiff, and how that impacts everything. And
Yes.
attorney's fees are a huge part of what's driving this.
Attorney's fees are a huge part of what's driving this. So what we have seen, without explanation, in that example that I provided you, $20 million for a technical paper violation that did not result in any lost wages or any impact to an employee, really. That is one example of what we've seen. But since Governor Brown put that transparency requirement in 2014, we've been able, obviously, to collect the data, because now they have to report every settlement under PAGA that is found. And over the last basically 8 to 9 years, there's been $8 billion in settlements under PAGA, $8 billion. And what we found on the analysis is that attorneys walk away with probably anywhere from $300,000 to approximately upper to $500,000, $600,000 in attorney's fees, and employees walk away with less than $100. And they get very little out of these PAGA lawsuits. It eliminates basically their right to have individual claims after it's been settled in a PAGA lawsuit. It's a huge boon for the trial attorney bar, very little for employers. Obviously, they get hit with these lawsuits, and very little benefit for the employees.
Well, and just to be fair, because we're just trying to balance the equation, there is an argument on the other side, and the argument on the other side is, well, if someone has an individual wage claim, it's not worth anybody's while to go forward because you got short of $100 or something. So you need to have these class actions to make it worthwhile for an attorney on the plaintiff side to handle these. But then again, there are these unintended consequences. And the cases that I've seen, attorneys' fees are a huge driving part. And by the way, what you didn't mention, Jennifer, which I know you're thinking about, is it's not just the attorney's fees you're paying to the plaintiff. It's the attorney's fees you're paying to your own counsel to defend yourself. And so it does add up. And I would say this, that those kind of cases where you have a person, like you mentioned about, the ABC situation, they can ask for 20 million. Now, do they end up with that? That's a different equation. But yeah, I have seen cases, it's not uncommon at all to see 7-figure demands initially. I'm not saying that's where they end up, but initially that does happen.
It does happen. And I would argue that those are cases where there is no damage. So what are we actually paying the money for? There's no damage. You know what I mean? It's not like the employee didn't know who their employer was. It's not like they weren't paid wages. So what was the damage? And on the individual claims, we have a very effective process through our labor commissioner office to handle these individual claims that may be low value, where they don't actually need an attorney to represent them, because the labor commissioner's office helps them file a claim and process it. So from our perspective, the whole intent of PAGA was to help bolster the labor commissioner's office, because at the time it was passed in 2004, it was underfunded. We now have a labor commissioner's office that is funded entirely by employer assessments every year. There is no limitation on their budget. They're the most highest staff they've been in the last decade, and the need for PAGA and the impact of PAGA to the employer community is being extremely detrimental to our business climate. And there is a process, an effective process for employees to have their claims heard. Again, our community, I would just say our business owners, they're not against paying an employee if they're owed wages at all. If they have misunderstood the law, if they have applied the law incorrectly, they are happy to make an employee whole. What they are opposed to is the litigation environment in California with the attorney's fees aspect of it, where the attorney's fees are driving the claims and not the actual damages of the employee.
Jennifer, I really appreciate what you're saying here, because I think it's great for our audience to understand how big an issue this is to the business community. It's a huge issue. The only thing I would say is, wage and hour laws, you and I know, man, there's a lot of rules. And one of the things I tell my students is, in the 1938 Act, they have there's an exemption for maple syrup workers. Well, why is that there? Well, it tells you two things. Number one is, man, there's a lot of rules here and sub rules, but also there must have been some really important senator from Vermont that got that exemption. But there's nothing unique about maple syrup workers, but there are so many things out there. And for a lot of the small employers, they don't know. And it's very easy to trip up. And then all of a sudden you get yourself stuck in this situation. Let me transition a little bit. I want to go with some more questions here. I have a question about how can California's economy continue to be resilient if there are regulations on such things as phasing out diesel trucks by 2036, when there's a lack of infrastructure to really make that transition happen?
Such a great question. Such a great question that we are dealing with in real time right now. We have a lot of aggressive climate goals here in California that have been passed. A lot of mandates, as you've have seen probably recently. The California Air Resources Board just passed the Advanced Clean Fleet Rule. We have goals to phase out the combustion engine in 2035. We have mandates with regards to the diesel trucks, of course. There is just a lot coming down in the climate change space to really turn our entire energy market into zero emissions. And that, great, you know what I mean, is a great goal. But how we get there, I don't know if we have a great strategy in place. As we all know, our electric grid basically came to a halt almost last summer with the increased rising temperatures, where there was literally text messages being sent out from the state to conserve energy because we were going to have blackouts in California. We are expecting to put millions of electric vehicles onto our grid with regards to charging. We are also adding all of these electric trucks and diesels to our grid, and we have not built out the infrastructure. There is a huge debate right now here at the state level with regards to interconnection of our transmission lines to simply hook up buildings and new housing developments to the grid. Some of the utility companies are like, hey, we can't do that for the next 8 to 10 months because we don't have the resources or the staff or the money to kind of build out the existing infrastructure because we're dealing with all these different mandates. It is something that we need to address now because there's warning signs all over the place that we are not ready yet to hit these goals because we don't have the infrastructure in place. And so I think it is a very real discussion that everybody here is having. It's not that we're saying climate change isn't happening. It's not that we're saying, hey, we don't need to get to a zero emission economy. It's saying that we are traveling down this path too quickly and our infrastructure is not there in place to keep up with it. And it's something that we really need to pay attention to so that the whole effort kind of doesn't crumble on itself.
Actually, as a matter of fact, I'm right now in the process of trying to plan perhaps even a 2-part series for our TV show on electric vehicles implementation. Cal Matters, pretty good outfit out of Sacramento,
Yes,
has done a series of reports on this. And so we're thinking maybe we're going to have them on to talk about, all the implications of moving toward electric vehicles. I want to ask a question. It's that Frank asks, which is, you hear a lot, and that is, taxation is getting companies to leave California. And before you answer the question, I will say this, to be fair, it depends what you're looking at. It's almost like one of those things, the answer depends on the question you're asking. There are some places where California is, quite high considered in taxation. Other things you look at, it's not as bad. And so it's kind of, sometimes there's cherry picking going on both sides. But with that caveat, I know business always has a concern about taxation. So what are your thoughts? Are we overtaxed? Are we taxed? I'm going to say, are we taxed just right? Or do we need to be taxed more?
We are overtaxed here in California. From my perspective, there's no question about it. Yes, we have stability on property taxes because it's in our Constitution, and that was in response to obviously increased property taxes that were going on at the time that Prop 13 was passed. That is our one shining star in the taxation arena. Aside from that, we have the highest personal income tax in the country. I think with exception of maybe Hawaii has beat us out at this point, but it's pretty significant. It's pretty high. And then we also have a very high corporate tax, which of course the Senate has just come out with saying that we should increase that for certain companies here in California by approximately 2%, which is pretty significant. Sales taxes, obviously based on different jurisdictions, can be quite high. So I would say we're pretty overtaxed, and there's some court decisions that have not helped that situation with regards to local jurisdictions and what taxes they can impose on the business community with a majority vote. And it's very costly, you know what I mean, to live here in California with regards to other states. So we are very concerned about what our tax environment is doing. And the challenge is, again, when we have proposals coming out, as I just mentioned, the Senate has said, hey, we should increase our corporate tax in California to deal with our impending budget deficit that I'm sure the governor is scheduled to announce tomorrow what our budget actually looks like. But in January,
he hasn't been very supportive of that point. And to put a fine point on it is kind of interesting. Their strategy is they're saying larger businesses should pay the 2%, but for smaller businesses, we're going to lower the rate. And so kind of like a divide and conquer strategy, I suppose. But the question is, I mean, there are a lot of businesses that are going over the line to Nevada
That's right.
because of a lower tax rate. And so, you know, and we are a more expensive state, so that's part of it too. But it's a complicated issue. The other one, maybe just touch on two things that make me think of it. How do you feel about a value-added tax? Number one, and number two, how do you feel about the fact that California is highly reliant on high-income individuals because we really focus on you know, capital gains and that thing. So in other words, you know, when the stock market tanks, California really feels it. So those two things, value-added tax, and do we need to restructure our tax system? Is that pie in the sky? It's just idealistic because no one will ever bite that bullet. Just too big a hit. I mean, what are your thoughts?
Yes, I think it's too aspirational to think that there would be an overhaul of our tax system. And a value-added tax, I think, is something that we would be interested in discussing. But again, it would require a broader overhaul of the tax system, which I don't think there's a political appetite to do. And so that is always the challenge, is that I think you really have to have a comprehensive reform and not just kind of like isolated tax reform. So that is the concern from that perspective. I don't think there's the political will. We are too dependent. The top 1% of our population pays 50% of the tax revenue in California. So if we lose anyone in that top 1%, which we have been, the Public Policy Institute of California recently came out with a report saying we are losing our top earners. You lose anybody in that, and it's a huge hit to the general fund.
Elon, please come back.
Yeah. As you saw, you know, there was this huge announcement that he was expanding here in California recently, but it's a big deal and it is making us too reliant. And it really creates this kind of very concerning situation that we are running into a place where we're losing our high earners, we're losing some of the middle class. They're going to other locations, whether it's because of our tax system or because of our housing market, or just because of the overall costs that are associated with living in California. And the ones who are here and can't move are on the lower wage side of things, and that is a huge disruption in our economy and quite honestly a potential recipe for disaster with regards to our revenues. So it is concerning. Our tax structure is not the most with regards to certainty and being able to kind of really create a dependable, reliant system of how we get our revenue, but that's not, from my perspective, going to change. And so how do we not overtax the ones who are producing the most for our revenue?
Well, I think it's in some ways, I think Jerry Brown kind of agrees with you in the sense that I'm not going to be able to change the tax code. So what I'll do is I'll create a larger rainy day fund. So when we have these wild fluctuations in the market, at least we have a rainy day fund, which, you know, what is it, $30 billion, whatever. It sounds like a lot of money, but when you consider the state budget and the hundreds of billions of dollars, you know, it's not going to get you very far,
That's
frankly,
right.
but it's at least an attempt to deal with those wild fluctuations that we see in revenues in California.
Oh, it's going to, I mean, tomorrow the budget's coming out. I suspect, you know, that the prediction is going to be worse than what was expected in January, which again was a $25 billion deficit. And
didn't a year ago, they were talking about a $31 billion surplus?
$94 billion surplus
94, okay.
last year.
Okay.
So we went from $94 billion
a
surplus, to potentially a $30 billion more deficit, which is pretty significant and is a reflection, again, of our tax system here in California.
Okay, so let me see. I'm going to try to read these questions here. You know, person's agreeing with you about PAGA reform. They don't feel like any legislative. You're going to have some supporters, I think, on that issue. Not getting any legislative relief. So we must fund and support the initiative on the ballot. Oh, that's really interesting. Initiative on the ballot to address PAGA. There is an argument, and I want to be we try to be balanced, you know, to hear both sides. And one of the things you hear about from the other side, and by the way, labor uses the initiative process too. So it's not like it's business uses it. Labor uses it as well. But the argument is that special interest groups use the referendum process to distort or subvert the legislative process. That someone puts up enough money to put something on the ballot as a way to circumvent the legislature. So they're saying that, you know, since Republicans are minorities in both houses in the California legislature, the only way Republicans can really affect policy is by going through the referendum process. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think there's two different things, and it's an important distinction because of what we're dealing with right now with the legislature. There's the initiative process, and then there's referendum process. And so I want to make that distinction.
Yeah, sorry.
Right,
yes,
it's okay.
Do.
Right now, under the referendum process is under attack because there are two referendums that are on the ballot in 2024, and a referendum, of course, as you know, is basically saying to the voters, do you agree with what the legislature did on these two policies? If you do, say yes. If you don't, say no. And the attack is that corporations are basically buying their way out of laws by going to the referendum and having the voters decide whether or not laws go into effect. The data does not support that. I will, the numbers I think suggest or prove that point. Every year in California, there's about, give or take, 1,000 bills that are signed into law, almost 1,000. Over the past 100 years, there have only been 33 laws that have been subject to a referendum. So if there's almost approximately 1,000 laws that are, signed into law every year, at least for the last 10 years, you know what I mean? I can say that statistic is pretty fair. Only 33 have been subject to a referendum. In the last 10 years, only 5 laws have been subject to a referendum. So the idea that corporations are buying their way out of laws or abusing the referendum process is just not reflected in the data. Now, on the initiative side, there are, as you all are aware, there are always these ballot propositions that are on every general election, and it seems that there is a growing number of those. And I think it is a reflection, again, of frustration over not being able to deal with policy in the legislature, to deal with policy. One of the big ones that was recently on our general election was dealing with Uber, Lyft, independent contractors, ride share companies, Prop 22. And that was because there was frustration from that industry with regards to getting any deal or negotiation or policy done in the legislature. So they turned to the ballot initiative process. The ballot initiative process is also a pathway to leverage policy in the legislature. So there is a provision in our statute that says once you have a qualified ballot, you have a certain number of days where you can remove that from the ballot if there's a legislative deal. And so what we see, and we just saw this last legislative cycle with regards to single-use plastics or packaging, is that they'll qualify a ballot initiative to leverage a deal in the legislature where there was potentially no leverage before. And yes, businesses utilize it, but as you said, Mark, labor utilizes the initiative process, not the referendum process, the initiative process just as much, if not more, I would say, than even the business community.
Well, one of the things that people are pointing through the referendum process was that I think it was tobacco companies had spent all this money to get a referendum on the ballot, which stalls the implementation of legislation until the vote. And so they put no money into the campaign to actually win the vote. And the argument was, well, the reason why they did that was for 2 years they were able to sell their product, and because the legislation's on hold until the voters vote. Mm-hmm. And so that's an example that people use about a perversion of the referendum process by some folks, but that's their argument.
Yep.
But you do point out there's some really important things I think you mentioned, which I think about as frankly as a mediator. You're right that why parties move to the initiative process is because they're not getting things done. They're not compromising the legislature, and so they feel like this is their only out to get some leverage. That threat that we're going to do an initiative, brings people to the table. Which is pretty interesting.
Initiatives are costly. It's not taken lightly by, I can tell you, either side. They're very costly projects.
Yes, and so just for people who may not know this, they're costly because that person standing outside a Target is getting paid. What do they get paid these days? $6, $7, $10 a signature?
It depends on the market. Yeah, it's all open to the free market, so it depends on what's going on at that point. Right. How much it costs. Yeah.
Right. But here's the bottom line: you better have some money if you're going to put an initiative up.
That's right.
Let me ask you this.
I can tell you, on the gambling initiatives, just to put it in perspective, I think there was over approximately $400 to $500 million spent on those initiatives last election cycle.
You start looking at these numbers, it's crazy numbers. Right. It really is.
Right.
Let me ask you about this. We talked about CEQA a little bit, the California Environmental Quality Act, and my gosh, they've been talking about reforming that. Everybody, wants California, I think, to be a leader in the environment and do good things, but it's one of these unintended consequences. It's a good idea, but then it kind of gets waylaid. And one of the issues there is green mail, where people use CEQA as a threat to stop a project that they don't want. It really has not a lot to do with the environment. It has to do with some personal interest. And there's been discussions over the years about amending or working on CEQA. Any inside information? Is that going to happen in the near term?
Hope springs eternal. I would hope so. Look, again, coming from the business community where they're, often narrative is that we're against the environment. That's not the case, and I don't think that there's an interest in completely repealing CEQA, but it definitely needs some reform. And there's certainly many examples of how it's been abused. Most recently, I think the frustration is that a lot of these clean energy projects that we are, trying to build, trying to move forward so that we do reach our climate goals are being held up because of CEQA. Which is kind of ironic given that we're seeking to improve the environment and yet we're being challenged under CEQA for impacting the environment. So there is huge frustration and it's building up. I think you see it mostly in our housing development. We have a huge housing shortage in California, which are driving up the cost of housing. I think the Department of Finance just recently released that our median housing prices in California are about $750,000 for a home. It's completely unaffordable, which is why, again, people are leaving California. The governor's even acknowledged that. The governor's frustrated. He said in a media report that is now being, questioned on what he's going to do about it, that he thought that CEQA needed to be reformed specifically for housing. We also have a lot of money coming into California from the federal law that passed with regards to building out infrastructure. We have billions of dollars coming into California to fix some of our infrastructure, and we want to be able to utilize that in the most effective and efficient way. And again, CEQA is one of the obstacles in the way to getting that done. So there is built up frustration. You've seen a crack a little bit in it in the housing space with some recent bills that have been passed, but it really does need a comprehensive overhaul so we can build out these clean energy projects, so we can build out our housing supply, so we can get moving here in California, which we're just not doing because of CEQA.
I want to kind of switch back in just because you've had a lot of people that are agreeing with you on the PAGA issue.
Yay, good.
Is there any study done? I haven't checked recently whether the LAO or I don't know, the state auditor, if someone has done a report, a nonpartisan report, not agenda driven, but a nonpartisan report on the impact of PAGA on businesses. Are you familiar with any of that, or is that being thought about or being done?
So there's always with the ballot initiative, there's a fiscal analysis that's done, but they haven't done an individual independent, the LAO specifically yet on the initiative, given that it's not on until 2024. There was, and again, this is just a snapshot, but with any budget change proposal that comes in from an agency, there is always a request for them, obviously, to justify why they need the money. And I can't remember the year. I want to say it was pre-COVID, so it was probably in 2019. The Department of Industrial Relations, the Labor Workforce Development Agency, which is the agency, obviously, that gets all of the PAGA notices and settlements that come in that I just referenced under the database, they did a request to increase the number of attorneys in their office that review the PAGA notices and settlements come in. And in their budget change proposal, they did an analysis of the number of claims that are being filed under PAGA. They gave an analysis with regards to the type of claims that are being filed. And in that analysis, from, again, the labor agency, which is not the business community at all, I can assure you, they said that the trial attorneys would give them a failing grade for accurately representing the interest of workers, that they were not, and that in the settlements they had reviewed that they were failing at representing the interest of workers. So I think from our perspective, you can't get kind of a better, more unbiased view from the business side than from the labor agency, who is charged with protecting employees, and they gave a scathing review against the trial.
Well, I would just say future attractions. You're going to be hearing a lot about PAGA, in the next election cycle, I'm assuming. Now I want to transition a little bit and talk about. I want to end up on a more positive, note. We're moving. Things are changing, and maybe things are changing. We've reached the kind of the bottom of this political polarization, and things are beginning to change. And probably and maybe I'm reading too much into this, but maybe one of the changes you're seeing is the changing of the guard at some of the, these major political, institutions, organizations that really have an impact on state government, like the Chamber of Commerce, like the California Labor Federation, both led by men for many years, now both led by women. What does that mean? Does that mean anything? Are we going to see a different approach to politics with different leadership?
Oh, I think, it changes things certainly from the perspective. I can tell you that, my perspective obviously is different than my long-term mentor, Alan Zarenberg, who was here for so many years. So I just think it naturally changes because of who you are and the perspective that you have. And I'm sure the same is for Ms. Gonzalez over at the Labor Federation. Whether it changes politics, of course, I think, again, with the change of perspective, it has to at some level. I certainly, again, was mentored by Ellen for many years, but I have my own vision and my own perspective on how the chamber should move forward in this new political environment. And so absolutely, it's going to have some impact on how we do business, on how we negotiate, on how we engage with our partners in labor, with our friends in the legislature. It's going to absolutely have an impact.
One thing I did want to talk a little about Alan Zarenberg. He was the president and CEO of the chamber for many, many years. He retired a few years ago, and unfortunately, he was stricken, and he passed away really unexpectedly, and people were really taken aback. And I just thought, I was looking at some of the remembrances of Alan, and it was interesting to me. I'll just read a few. Robbie Hunter, who's retired leader of the State Building Construction Trades Council of California, a labor leader,
Yes.
said, quote, "He was a genuine person that did care about working people," unquote. Anna Monsantos, who's a Democrat, advisor to Governors Newsom, Brown, also Arnold Schwarzenegger, considered him a mentor. Governor Newsom said when he passed, quote, "A fair and decent man to his core, Alan always strived to build relationships and trust across the board, an increasingly rare feat," unquote. Is there something we could all learn from Alan's approach to politics?
Oh, absolutely. He was crazy smart too. So he was super, super smart on policy, but his whole approach was dealing was relationship focused, and he really would put a lot of work into developing those relationships with, again, people who you would think wouldn't naturally be aligned with him, just so that they could have a conversation. I think what you said earlier, Mark, about the polarization of politics is true, and there's so many times that just having a basic conversation with the other side will really reflect and highlight where there is room for negotiation. And I feel like that is what is missing so much in politics right now, is to have those candid and very open conversations to see where the middle ground is. Alan was great about that. Again, he established the relationships with all different types of partners, as you just reflected with those comments. And it really is what made him effective in his ability to get things done, and is something, obviously, that I hope I can replicate in a lot of the work that we do going ahead with the chamber.
That really underscores something we refer to as the Maddy way. And one of the things that Senator Maddy was known for was that very thing, that working across the aisle, the ability to compromise. His approach to negotiations was instructive. He said, you never view your adversary as your enemy. They just have a different perspective, different life experience. You're all aiming at point B, just have a different way to get there. And he said, when you're in negotiations, always try to make sure the other side wins something. That way they'll want to work with you in the future. And I think that really is emblematic. I mean, every year we have an event in Sacramento. One's coming up on May 22nd for those who might be interested. And very often, and again this year, Willie Brown, the former Democratic Speaker of the Assembly, known at one point, I guess someone referred to him as the Ayatollah of the Assembly, because he was such an iron fist, does MC to our event. And I once asked him, I said, why do you come all the way up from San Francisco to do an event to support the Maddy Institute, which really provides funds and scholarships for Valley students? And he spoke about the integrity of Ken Maddy. And he said that he was one of the few people they said he would come back to Sacramento for. And it does bespeak about a different time in the golden age of California politics, which I'm hoping we can return to, where people said we had differences, but you work them out. It's not my way or the highway. It's we're all in this together. We're all in the same boat. And if we're punching holes in it, it just hurts everybody. So it's I think that's pretty instructive. And I had a chance to meet Alan when he was CEO of the chamber, and a really nice man. I really enjoyed speaking with him. Is there anything at the end here that you'd like to comment about? We've got maybe about 10 minutes left. This is kind of a big question. I don't think you'll need more than 10 minutes, I'm afraid. What can the state do to address the negative perceptions that California has among some business leaders, while still meeting, what Governor Brown once referred to as California's two-tier economy? How do you balance that?
Oh, yeah, you're right. That is a very big question. I think what California really needs to do and address, and we've talked about this kind of throughout the different discussions we've had, is we are a very high cost state from all perspectives. From the tax perspective, again, housing, energy, There is just a number of different factors with regards to what it costs to live here in California. And I would argue that the reason that it is such a high cost state is because of some of the underlying policies, some that we've highlighted, but others that we have not, that drive that cost. I think the idea so much is that business will just carry the burden of these costs and will never be passed on to consumers, and that's not reflected in our economy. They will pass it on to consumers. They're not going to take all of the hits, and so that is just a natural part of, again, doing business and how they deal with the costs that are ultimately passed on for some of these policies. And so, as we talked about before, again, it doesn't have to be an overhaul of all of these different laws that are in place. We're not asking for there to be no environmental consideration. We're not saying that employees shouldn't be paid wages. We're not saying that people's data shouldn't be protected in some way. But there has to be more balance with regards to the policies that are being passed in Sacramento, so that there is an understanding, there is a recognition of what this is doing to our business economy, how those mandates are impacting everyday consumers, and what we can do to kind of balance or create a more balanced approach to a lot of, again, these ideas that are coming through. I think that there is examples of it moving in that direction, but of course it isn't there yet, where I would say that that is a significant movement to really trying to get a moderate perspective on some of these issues. And if businesses in California, I think businesses appreciate that there's going to be some type of higher cost to doing business in California. I think they just expect that. But again, it's getting to a point where it is too high of a cost. And you've seen, again, businesses unfortunately leaving or saying they're not going to continue to stay in California. And we certainly don't want that to become, a growing trend at all. So my takeaway is I always say you don't have to you do everything for the business community to make them feel here. You just have to acknowledge that they are an important part of this conversation, that they are obviously critical to the success of our economy, and reflect that recognition through small policy adjustments that really do indicate you're taking into consideration their interests. And that's what we hope to see more in some of this legislation.
Well, Senator Maddy thought that the people from the Valley had this unique ability to bring folks together. I don't know if it was because of our agriculture, you got to get along because you got to make sure the product gets, produced, what have you. But he thought there was something unique about Valley politicians. He used to call them Valleycrats, right? Whether they're Republican or Democrat, he worked across the aisle. I'm thinking, given your background in labor and working on the management side in labor employment stuff, and your counterpart at the California Labor Federation also working on labor issues, as a labor mediator and arbitrator myself, I'm thinking this is a great combination of people who know how to compromise. They know how to work because they have to. So I'm looking at this and being very optimistic about the future of California. And I want to thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us today. We really appreciate it. And to the rest of the folks, this is probably going to be our last Maddy Associate event for this semester. We'll be picking it up again in September. We hope you join us, and we hope you support the Maddy Institute. One last little advertisement. We do have a fundraiser in Sacramento on March 22nd. The money raised will go for student scholarships. We rely very heavily on that. If you believe in what we're doing, please support us. So thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the day. Jennifer, if you could hang on for just a moment.
No problem.
Talk for a second.